I I'm just kind of curious on your take. Like, what's your notion of like the problem of evil? Do you think it's like as big of a problem for you? Do you think like, you know, like what's your kind of like view on that?
Um, I don't think it's a big problem for me, and I think that's just because the way I was introduced to Christianity, I wasn't even thinking about the problem of evil before I had uh but before I was like completely immersed in orthodoxy, because I think orthodoxy really is uh the best counter to the problem of evil, especially the way Seraphim Hamilton put it, because he was really my introduction to orthodoxy, in a serious way. And it's that, um, for one, God does not create evil, so the evil itself does not originate in God. And really, to understand this, you need to remember that God is communion and being is communion. So how can something exist yet not exist and not be a part of God? Because there clearly is evil. And I've sort of the best way I've come to think about it is as self-relation. So evil is self-relation, and goodness and being itself is communion. Now self-relation literally doesn't exist. Like, think about, um, in order to have any sort of thing, you already need to have communion. You already need to have a distinction, and they're, in some way, interacted with each other. But to have a pure self relation, that is what Hegel calls pure indeterminate being. Now, pure indeterminate being is nothing. So I think Hegel's already done the work for us when we're saying that if you're trying to think of being outside of communion, you're thinking of nothing. And what is sin? Sin. What is evil? Evil is nothing. So pure self-relation is evil, is nothing, and then goodness is communion. Now, at the same time, so that's sort of how I would understand evil itself. It's not that evil is something like you have this idea of the devil and you're going to some substantial evil. No, there is no evil. Ultimately, it is, for one, I would say idolatry is improper relations. So it's a relation that is not complete, not hell in the sense of, because I'd also emphasize that the sin itself is hell. Like, hell isn't. I don't think we can um I don't think we can separate the punishment from the act itself. There is, insofar as we haven't reached hell yet, there is a divide here, but I would say hell itself is the place where the punishment and the act itself become one. Just the very fact of existing in your state, that is the punishment. Um, so I would say, for one, it was this idea of evil not as substantial that really helped me thinking of the problem of evil. But then something like, so just very, very simple question: why would God allow a tsunami to kill thousands of innocent men, women, and children? Um, well, ultimately, I think it does come down to a sort of mystery to God's creation and his providence, not knowing. But at the same time, you have, in orthodoxy, um, it's really stressed that man is the microcosm of creation, and it was through man that sin entered the world and there was destruction. So the natural world itself is, for one, under the dominion of the devil, who is obviously under the providence of God. He is not outside of it, but still, the world itself is under the dominion of Satan, or was until Christ. But his influence is still here in a way. And it's man's actions. It was through man that sin entered into the world. It was through man that this disharmony came, between creation and the world happened, because man is the microcosm, um, connecting heaven and creation. Um, and that is in a very, very literal sense. It's like, how did the divine come into the world? It was through a man. It was through Christ. It's not. It's like that is why Christ became a man. That is why man is the image of God, because man is the mediator between heaven and hell. Sorry, heaven and creation, and then Jesus is the perfect mediator. He is the mediator because he is perfectly God and man at the same time. So some people have an issue with Christ being, like, when Christians say that Christ will be in human form for the rest of time. But that's like having an issue with someone living in their own house until they die. It's like someone who perfectly built this house that they love. Like, to an even greater extent, God made man to be his image. He made man perfect, and like was his plan was to unite with mankind, and it's through mankind that all of creation is either glorified or becomes corrupted. So one of the big things that I think many Protestants probably just have a hard time accepting, and it may lead to, I'm not sure, I'm sure it does lead some very rational people into apostasy, is the idea that God is just controlling everyone. There's no free will, and everyone dying in all of these natural disasters that seem so unnecessary. This is all just God choosing for that to happen. When in reality, God made the world in a certain way so that our free actions truly do influence the world. And beyond that, there are good and evil angelic powers that are exerting influence on creation. So it's by understanding it in this way that you can see how all of this evil stuff happens, even to innocence, and ultimately the everything that occurs in the world will be made perfect in the end. It will all be shown to be a part of God's plan in the end, because Christ is the victor in history. So I think that's sort of the lesson of the book of Job, is that there's very bad readings of the book of Job, and I'm not an expert on it at all, but fundamentally the lesson is very simple. It's that God glorifies through or God glorifies through even using the devil, even using misery, because it's been introduced into creation against the will of God. But he will use this in order to ultimately in order for his will to be done. So there's something in Job, I wish I knew the details of it, but he began with like a certain amount of children and a certain amount of animals, and by the end of the book they've literally doubled. So the point is that he went through all of this, but in the end he got even more than he had before. So the lesson from that is that all our spiritual trials, all the misery we go through, is ultimately directed towards the end if we align ourselves with the will of God towards towards our own glorification and our own salvation.
Yeah, I heard one explanation of this that I'm not sure if it would have been helpful to people, but I think it was helpful for me at the beginning. Was this idea, like I think you're right? So when we look at sin and sort of like our egos, what's ironic about sin is that sin itself is non-existent, but you really feel this in the self, because you can feel this as like a void, as like this perpetual void. And the very fact, just to like use the con stuff, right? The very fact that there is no satisfaction, that our satisfaction is just almost, it, it just can't be satisfied. It's always perpetual. And so this perpetual void of never achieving satisfaction is what my opinion is what I would call like hell. Um, and it's funny because, when we talk about, if we use like light and dark as metaphors, light doesn't necessarily create darkness, right? but it's the fact that light shines that you see darkness around it.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's just darkness itself is this non-existence. It is this like kind of like void thing. It's just that once light appears, you see the darkness. Um, and this is what I even like about the notion of like the banality of evil from Hannah Arendt, I believe, where you cannot literally fathom all the evil that is going on because it's so perpetually normalized. And I think this is what's useful, for people that are trying to understand sin and so on, is that when you begin, and I almost want to say, if you take like even a empirical experimental approach, right? If you just see experimentally when you refrain yourself from something, you start to see you have a hard time avoiding it. You have a hard time following through with it. Why is that? Why can't I refrain from, lying? Why can't I refrain from, maybe getting into sort of adulterous relationships? You start to see easily that this notion of sin is very apparent in your life just from the act of trying to refrain from your desire. And it's this very refraining that you start to notice that it has become like a perpetual void in your life, without you having realized it until you began to refrain from it. And this is
Right.
what I love about, and this is why I don't even try to engage in too much theological talk, because in my opinion, it's that the commandments themselves or any type of spiritual practice really shows itself. It doesn't show itself until you involve yourself in it. And I think a lot of people miss that point. So even like the questions on suffering and so on, I mean, we can try to make sense of this theologically, but I always refrain from it because I just feel like once you start diving yourself in through the experiment, through the just let me try it out and see what I can achieve from this, you might come to an understanding that kind of goes above theology. I think theology sort of appealed to the common people, but it does not always appeal to our temperaments. It doesn't appeal to everybody's,
Hmm.
yeah, it doesn't appeal to everybody's temperaments. But to kind of add to something else that you said, I think a reversal is sometimes interesting. And I read this from Iqbal. It's not that man should have faith in God, right? But that God is letting these things happen because God is wanting to have faith in man, which is I thought was a very interesting reversal, where it's like, God is sort of letting some of these things happen, you could say, and it's our responsibility, our kind of like calling to sort of rise to something more above ourselves.